Hi friends, so I just finished reading Cal Newport's new book, A World Without Email, and I wanted to share some of my key takeaways from that book. His previous book, Deep Work, was hugely influential on me, and I did feel like this book would have a lot of things that are relevant to me because I'm the head of engineering at a startup. Hi, Safe Doing. And we're small enough that we can make kind of drastic changes to how we work, but we're also big enough that communication is starting to become something we need to be more deliberate about. And I know from past experience, if I just let email and Slack reign free, it's very easy to get into the pattern where I'm just jumping from one fire to the next without getting really much done. And even though I feel like I'm being super busy or super productive, I just kind of end up spinning my wheels and not making much headway on anything important. So the book is divided into two sections. In the first part, he kind of just lays out the problem. And then in the second part, he goes a bit more into different approaches and solutions you can implement. In the first part, he details something he calls the hyperactive hive mind workflow. This is basically a representation of how we work today. Dealing with things like email or Slack has become a significant part of most people's day job, even though they're normally hired to be programmers or hired to be designers or something like that. They still spend a lot of their time and energy on just communicating about the work and communicating with others about their work. So he brings up a couple of studies that kind of highlights the scale of the problem. I'll just pull in some of the numbers. In one survey, the average knowledge worker goes through 126 emails sent or received per business day. There was also some data released by Rescue Time. On one of the surveys they released, they saw that the average person checks their email every 6 minutes. They did another study where they separated the day into 5-minute blocks, and they tried to measure how much time someone went for 5 minutes of concentrated work, so not checking Slack or checking email. The average was, I think, 15 blocks a day. So how you can view that is that in an average day, they would spend 1 hour and 15 minutes of concentrated effort, and the rest would kind of just be checking emails all the time. One of the main points he makes in this book is just that email reduces productivity. Two of the main things he brings in as why email is not good for productivity is context switching, and also that it's not a very efficient way of communicating. Often a thing you could solve in a 5-minute phone call will go back and forth in 12 different emails, and each time is another little interruption. The more effort I put into my own focus, the more I noticed that context switching is just bad for you. I'll pull in a tweet from my boy Elon here. Context switching is the mind killer. I think it's easy to think that the cost of context switching is the time you spend on the other thing. So you might be jumping from email to a programming task, and obviously you lose the time you spend on email. But the real cost comes from how your mind becomes fragmented. So you're partially thinking about the things in the email and you just won't be able to perform as well on another cognitive task. One other thing he mentions that impacts productivity is that the current culture of communication we have at work leads people to feel overloaded, which also has a negative impact on productivity. Which brings us to the next point he makes, that email does not only make us less productive, it makes us miserable. One of the reasons it makes us miserable is because it has a tendency to lead to overload, where you just feel like you have so many responsibilities and there's no way you can catch up with all of them, so you just always feel like you're lagging behind. It also leads to people checking work at night or not being able to fully disconnect in weekends. You also have this tendency to get a response rate arms race, where if someone responds quickly, that kind of sets the norm for how other people feel like they should behave. The final point he makes when defining the problem is trying to kind of reason out how we got here. We didn't decide that this was the optimal way to work. It was more just a consequence of the new technology that arrived. He brings up an interesting example for one of the earlier places to implement emails, which I think was Bell Labs. They were using a bunch of more manual tools to communicate with each other, and they were thinking they could replace this with email. But what happened was, after they implemented email, this type of communication increased 6-fold within a week. So it's not just that email is replacing less efficient communication norms. It is creating its own communication, which can be really harmful for people staying productive. I think people are starting to appreciate how harmful constant communication can be for certain types of jobs. You have the Paul Graham essay about makers and managers, where he talks about how you have makers like designers or programmers whose job it is to make something. You have to protect their time and focus so they don't spend too much time on needless meetings. But then on the other hand, you have managers whose days are much more fragmented, and that's just kind of the natural flow of things. And then you have a final category that Cal brings up, which is supporters, which are even more fragmented than the managers because their main task is kind of to deal with incoming requests or helping other people. And one point Cal makes is that even if you are a supporter or a manager, it is still really important to get your communication under control, because even if you have a lot of incoming requests, you want to deal with them one at a time and focus on that until it's done. I think the reason he brings this up is that a lot of managers or supporters kind of embrace the distracted life in terms of email. And the interesting example he brings up is of a general called George Marshall, who was basically organizing the war effort for the United States in World War II. And you would think if anyone is in a high stakes situation where they need to be available and can't take time to focus, it would be someone in that position. But he details how Marshall saw the importance of focus, and his most important contribution to what he was doing was deep and focused thinking, even if it was on a lot of small incoming tasks. So he details in the book how he set up his war efforts to align with being able to give each individual decision his full focus until he moved on to something else. So I think in particular, if you are in a situation where you feel like you have to check your email every 5 minutes, that this book might be interesting for you. He basically outlines how the current workflow with email is not something that we landed on through rational thought. It is more just a result of reducing friction in communication. It comes down to a tragedy of the commons that for each individual, they're best served just sending out emails so they can get response to their questions faster. But if everyone just sends out a bunch of requests all the time, it becomes chaos for everyone. In terms of how to deal with this or how to think about this problem going forward, he has a couple of principles he outlines. The first one is attention capital principle. The attention capital principle basically say that if we can find better and more sustainable workflows, we can significantly increase the productivity of knowledge workers. And you want to optimize workflows around protecting people's attention. An analogy he uses in the book is comparing it to the factory worker and how Ford revolutionized productivity in the manual labor market. And he feels like we are due a similar revolution in the knowledge market, where we are currently very inefficient. There's two paths when it comes to protecting people's attention. It is either making systemic changes, which is what a company can do, but what most of us have to deal with is making our own personal changes. One thing he suggests when making personal changes is that you shouldn't announce it to the world. You should just try to make a change that is reasonable and that gives you more time to focus. And your attention should be on never dropping the ball and delivering value. And if you manage to do that and people know they can trust you, then they won't complain if you take an hour or two more to respond to emails or Slack than other people. The second principle he goes through is the process principle. The process principle is basically that we can significantly increase productivity and reduce stress by introducing smarter processes. He outlines 3 important steps for processes. 1 is that it should be easy to see who is working on what. 2 is that work can unfold without a significant amount of ad hoc communication. 3 is that there is a known way for updating work assignments as the process progresses. He basically highlights 2 ways to go about this. One is a fully automated process. One way I've seen this implemented is some YouTubers use this for editing videos, where there is a step-by-step process of who is responsible for doing what part of the video. And the process just takes care of whose job it is to do what. And they don't need to talk or organize about who is doing what when. It just follows the process. There's other types of work that it would be harder to do an automatic process for, things like design or developing a project that has a lot of back and forth. In cases like that, he suggests using boards with columns and cards on these columns So things like Trello or Jira or Flow is something else he mentions. The main goal here is to get the communication out of Slack and email and instead gather all the communication about specific tasks on the specific cards in the board. This also means that you can make it easier to see what you should prioritize at any given moment instead of just having a bunch of things coming in from everywhere. Another principle is the protocol principle. This is basically about setting up streamlined workflows for anything that happens regularly. So something like scheduling meetings or onboarding new clients. You should have systems in place that means you can minimize the amount of back and forth communication and instead just have it happen automatically. These protocols and processes can come with some extra headway in the start when setting them up, but you kind of just need to accept this as part of the cost, because right now how a lot of people deal with email is just so costly that they're hardly getting any work done. So even if it adds some friction in certain parts of the job, it is still much better than dealing with constant ad hoc communication. The last principle he brings up in the book is the specialization principle. What this is about is that in the past there would be a lot more supporting workers for knowledge workers because there was so much friction in the process. For example, booking a meeting would require phone calls and you would have a secretary to help with that. But now that a lot of these things are a lot more streamlined, a lot of those jobs have gone away, but he makes the point that you should hire more people specialized in each of these different areas instead of just offloading all the miscellaneous admin tasks to a person who's specialized in a completely different field. So to summarize my main takeaways from this book, I already implemented some of these things after reading Deep Work, where I started to see how harmful communication through things like Slack or email was for my output. So after I noticed that, I set up 2 hours at the start of each workday where I can't access Slack, I can't access email, just so I can make sure I make some significant progress on the most important tasks I have. A few things I think I can be more diligent with after reading this book is that one, I want to be on guard for back and forth communication through either Slack or email, where I feel like it could just be easier to go on a call and sort it out there. Another thing is that we're already in the process of getting away from just ad hoc communication about tasks on Slack and instead building process around them. But I could do a better job of both involving everyone in the team on decisions of how these things should be implemented and also making sure that we're moving in the right direction with these things. I do think another part this book highlights, which is really important, is that not only is this about being more productive, but also about feeling better about our work. Feeling like if you take a day off, that you're just going to build up an array of unfinished things you need to jump on when you get back is not a good place to be. And not only is it not a good place to be, but you're also able to just do more if there is less on your plate, even if that seems a bit counterintuitive. So for my thoughts on this book, I feel like it would have been more impactful if I read it before I read Deep Work, because I already internalized how bad some of these distractions are after reading Deep Work. But I would say absolutely read it if you are someone who checks your email more than twice per hour. And I think it can be particularly useful if you are in a manager or a supporter role to read this book, because it gives you some new perspectives maybe that you hadn't considered. So I think basically this book comes down to a similar message of Deep Work, that you want to avoid being distracted so you can do better work while being focused. If you want to see one of the easiest and most reliable methods I have found in the last few years to become more focused, you should check out my video on FocusMate, which should appear somewhere. Okay, so I think that was it from me and this book today. Thank you for watching, and I will see you next Wednesday.